Did you know that Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden didn't need food or water? They lived in perfect harmony with God, untouched by the earthly needs that now define our existence. But what happened when they were cast out? What changed? And how did their bodies transform in this new world? Today, we're diving deep into the incredible journey of Adam and Eve after their banishment. From being created as spiritual beings in the garden to facing the harshness of the world outside, their story is not just one of fall, but of faith, redemption, and God's mercy. Imagine their confusion, their fear, and their hunger as they faced a world so different from the one they had once known. It wasn't just a physical change. It was a complete transformation of their very essence. No longer were they the perfect beings who walked with God in Eden, but now they were earthbound, struggling with needs and desires they had never known. And in this struggle, Satan's schemes didn't cease. He still sought to thwart God's plan, turning blessings into tests. But even in their suffering, God's mercy shone through. He didn't abandon them. Instead, he turned their trials into lessons, their struggles into blessings. Through each challenge, Adam and Eve learned the value of faith, perseverance, and the undeniable power of God's provision. So, join me now as we explore what happened after they were banished, how they learned to live in a world of hunger and thirst, and how God continued to show them His mercy, even in the midst of their greatest trials. Together, let's uncover the depths of their story, finding in it lessons that resonate with each of us today. When Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, they were no longer in the place of peace and abundance that God had created for them. They were now in a world they had never known, a world where their bodies and spirits would be tested by hunger, thirst, and the need for shelter. Their once immortal forms, free from all earthly limitations, had transformed. The vibrant life they lived in Eden had been replaced by a harsh reality. They could feel their bodies growing weaker, their stomachs beginning to hunger for food, and their throats dry with thirst. The beauty of Eden was gone, replaced by a land that demanded physical labor, where everything needed to be earned through sweat and struggle. This was their new reality. They had always known that their bodies would change, but they never imagined how drastically. Before, they had lived in communion with God, in a state of perfect harmony, without ever needing sustenance. But now, as earthly beings, their bodies cried out for nourishment. Their hearts were still connected to God, but their flesh, tied to the dust, began to long for things they had never needed before. Imagine the shock they must have felt. It wasn't just the physical changes, it was the spiritual shift as well. The loss of their original divine state must have weighed heavily on them. Yet, even in the midst of this drastic change, God did not leave them to wander without guidance. His mercy was always there, even in their weakest moments. Their first lesson in this new world was one of trust and faith. Though their bodies were weak, their spirits still had to remain strong. It was not enough for them to simply survive. They had to learn to live according to God's plan for them in this new and unfamiliar reality. This world, so different from the garden, was still part of God's creation. And in that, there was hope. The moment they felt hunger, they realized they could no longer rely on the effortless supply of Eden. They now had to work for everything. And yet, in this very moment of struggle, God's provision began to take shape. They were not alone. Even as they faced the difficulty of living outside Eden, God was already showing them His care. Satan's attempt to destroy the fig trees. As Adam and Eve began to adapt to their new reality, Satan's envy and hatred of God's creation pushed him to devise yet another plan to cause harm. We know that Satan's goal has always been to lead humanity away from God, to thwart his plans and to bring suffering. And so, when Adam and Eve found themselves struggling with the basic needs of life, Satan saw an opportunity. He sought to make their journey even harder, to keep them in despair, and to prevent God's mercy from reaching them. One of Satan's first attacks came when Adam and Eve were sent to retrieve the figs from the cave. But Satan, always filled with malice and bitterness, took the figs and buried them in the ground, hoping to destroy them completely. His evil plan was simple. If he could destroy the figs, Adam and Eve would be left without the sustenance they needed. Without food, they would weaken and surely perish. But as always, God's wisdom and power prevailed. In a remarkable twist of fate, God used Satan's evil scheme to create something beautiful. Instead of allowing the figs to wither and die, God turned them into two strong and flourishing fig trees, growing right outside the entrance of the cave. These trees were a gift from God, an unexpected blessing in the midst of their trials. The trees offered shade and nourishment, and for the first time since their banishment, Adam and Eve found a place of rest and comfort. Satan, seeing that his plans had been completely thwarted, was filled with regret. He had tried to destroy the figs, to strip Adam and Eve of what little they had left, but instead, he had unwittingly created a blessing. The trees stood as a visible reminder of God's power and Satan's failure. But even though the trees were a sign of God's mercy, Adam and Eve still struggled. As they stood before the two fig trees, they were confused. Had they come to the wrong cave? Was this a trick? Why did these trees appear out of nowhere seemingly overnight? In their minds, doubt crept in. Could Satan have deceived them once again? Adam, filled with uncertainty, turned to Eve, and together they prayed. They asked God for clarity, for understanding. "Lord," Adam prayed, "is this your plan? Or have we been misled again?" In that moment of doubt, God responded to their prayer. His word came to Adam, explaining everything. God told Adam that Satan had taken the figs and buried them. But God, in his mercy, had turned them into trees for their benefit. These trees would provide rest and nourishment, a reminder of both Satan's evil schemes and God's gracious protection. God's message to Adam was clear. "Do not fear. These trees are my gift to you, a sign of my love and care. You will rest under their branches, but you are not to eat their fruit. Trust in me." Adam and Eve's journey was far from over, but in this moment, they were reminded that God's plans were far greater than Satan's schemes. Satan may have tried to harm them, but God turned that harm into a blessing. These trees, growing where Satan had intended destruction, were now a sign of hope. The faithfulness of God was ever present, even in their darkest moments. And yet, Adam and Eve, in their newfound humility, still feared the unknown. They had learned to trust God, but their experiences in the world outside Eden made them cautious, unsure of what lay ahead. Even with the trees standing as a reminder of God's provision, they remained hesitant, uncertain of their future. But God's assurance gave them strength. He reminded them that their faith would carry them through. Satan had tried to destroy their sustenance, to bring them further away from God, but once again he failed. God used what Satan meant for harm to bring about a greater good. This event was a reminder of the power of God's mercy and his ability to turn even the darkest schemes into opportunities for blessings. In the end, Adam and Eve had to learn to trust God in a world that had changed so dramatically. They had to learn to see his hand in the midst of their trials. The fig trees were just one of many examples of how God would continue to provide for them, even as they wandered in a world that no longer felt like home. As they learned to trust, Adam and Eve began to see that every difficulty, every challenge, was an opportunity to grow in faith. And just as God had transformed the figs into trees, he would continue to transform their lives, turning their struggles into blessings. Through their journey, Adam and Eve would come to understand that though they were no longer in Eden, God's love and mercy would always follow them. Even in a fallen world, they were never alone. And in the midst of the trials that Satan threw their way, God's blessings were always near. This was the beginning of their earthly existence, one of struggle, yes, but also of growth, learning, and an ever-deepening faith in the God who created them. As Adam and Eve faced the full weight of their new earthly existence, one of the most profound changes they encountered was their need for food. In Eden, they had never known hunger. Their bodies sustained effortlessly by the abundance that surrounded them. The lush trees, the flowing rivers, and the endless fruits of the garden provided them with all they could ever need. But now, outside the garden, everything had changed. Their bodies were no longer the immortal, divine forms they had once known. They were now bound to the earth, subject to its laws, its hunger, its thirst. The first time Adam and Eve felt the pangs of hunger, it must have been an overwhelming shock. The reality of their transformation settled in as they realized they no longer had the luxury of divine provision at their fingertips. Their stomachs growled with an unfamiliar emptiness, a constant reminder of their new vulnerability. This was no longer a world where food was a simple gift. It was now a necessity, one that demanded labor and effort. For the first time in their lives, they had to work for their survival. This was a heavy burden. Adam, the first man, was now the provider for both himself and Eve. Gone were the days when the fruits of Eden grew effortlessly around them. Now, he had to search, dig, gather, and work the land, and every piece of food he found was a product of his effort and struggle. Eve, too, was no longer free from the labor of survival. She felt her body grow weary, and the pain of hunger gnawed at her. Their struggle with food was not only physical, but emotional. In Eden, food had been a blessing, a part of the abundant life God had given them. But now, food had become a symbol of their fall. The act of eating, once a simple act of nourishment, had now become a reminder of their disobedience. Their desire for sustenance, once innocent and pure, now held the weight of their sin. And yet, even in the midst of their struggle, God's mercy shone through. He had not abandoned them. They could still rely on him, even as they were learning to rely on the earth. The simple act of food became a profound reminder of God's ongoing presence. As their hunger grew, so too did their dependence on God. And though they had been banished from the garden, God was still providing for them in ways they could not yet fully understand. They were learning that food was not just a physical need, but a spiritual one. It was a reminder of the grace of God, a grace that would sustain them not only through physical nourishment, but also through the trials of their new existence. God had not left them without hope or provision. He had merely changed the way in which they would experience his blessings. The simple act of eating became a reflection of their trust in God's provision. They could no longer take their sustenance for granted, but in each meal, they were given the chance to offer thanks to the Creator who had not forsaken them. Their bodies, though now bound to the earth, were still part of his divine plan, and through their hunger, they would come to understand the deep connection between physical sustenance and spiritual life. Satan's deception and the fig trees. As Adam and Eve began to adapt to their new world, struggling with hunger and the harshness of their earthly existence, Satan remained ever watchful, eager to exploit their vulnerability. His bitterness toward them, toward God's creation, never ceased. From the moment of their expulsion from Eden, he had sought to undermine God's work, to draw them further away from his love. And so he devised a new plan to deceive them, one that would test their faith even further. It began with the figs. In their search for nourishment, Adam and Eve were sent to gather the figs from a particular spot. These figs, small as they were crucial to their survival, and they trusted in God's instructions. But Satan, knowing their need, saw an opportunity to hinder them. Filled with malice, he took the figs and buried them outside their cave, hoping to deprive them of this vital source of food. His plan was simple, yet cruel. If he could destroy the figs, he would leave Adam and Eve weak, vulnerable, and desperate. They would be forced to face the harsh world without the sustenance they needed, and in their desperation, they might turn away from God in their frustration. But Satan had miscalculated. God's wisdom and mercy were far greater than Satan's schemes. Instead of allowing the figs to wither or be lost, God took what Satan had meant for evil and turned it into a blessing. He caused the figs to grow into two beautiful fruit-bearing trees right outside the entrance of their cave, providing shade, shelter, and nourishment in a way that Adam and Eve could never have anticipated. These trees, which grew on the eastern side of the cave, stood as a reminder of God's power and mercy. What Satan had meant to destroy, God had transformed into something even greater. The trees were a symbol of the ongoing battle between good and evil, and of God's unwavering commitment to his creation. Satan's attempt to harm Adam and Eve had only resulted in a deeper display of God's glory. When Adam and Eve first saw the trees, they were puzzled. They had not seen these trees grow before. How could they have appeared so suddenly? Were they being tricked again? Could this be another one of Satan's deceptions, a way to mislead them once more? Their minds were filled with doubt. The journey through this new world had already been so confusing. And now, this mysterious appearance of trees outside their cave only added to their uncertainty. But as always, God provided clarity. Adam and Eve prayed to him, asking for guidance, for understanding. They knew that they could not navigate this world on their own, that they needed God's direction more than ever. And so, God spoke to Adam, explaining what had happened and revealing his plan. Adam, God said, Satan took the figs and buried them outside the cave, thinking he could destroy them, but I turned his plan upside down. I caused those figs to grow into trees for you. They will provide you with shade, nourishment, and a reminder of my power over evil. God's word was clear. These trees were a gift, a sign of his continued mercy. Adam and Eve were to rest under their branches, but they were not to eat the fruit. The trees, though a blessing, were also a test of obedience. They were a reminder that even in the midst of God's provision, they must continue to trust him, to follow his instructions, and to remember that their ultimate hope lay not in the fruit of these trees, but in their faithfulness to God. And so, even though the trees were a symbol of God's grace, they also represented the ongoing struggle between good and evil. Adam and Eve were still living in a world where Satan's influence was ever present, but they had been given the power to resist his schemes. The fig trees, standing strong against the forces of darkness, were a sign that God's love would always prevail. This moment was a turning point for Adam and Eve. Though they faced uncertainty and doubt, they were reminded that God was still with them, providing for them and guiding them through every challenge. The trees were a visible reminder that Satan could not win. God's plan would always be greater. Through the fig trees, Adam and Eve learned that even in their most vulnerable moments, they could trust in God's provision. They could not see the end of their journey, but they could rest in the knowledge that God was walking with them, turning the darkness of the world into a place of hope and light. As they rested under the branches of the trees, Adam and Eve understood that their journey was not just about survival, but about learning to trust in God's love and guidance. Every trial they faced, every doubt that arose, was an opportunity to grow in faith, and they would soon learn that God's plan was unfolding in ways they could never have imagined. As Adam and Eve began to come to terms with their new life outside the garden, they found themselves relying more and more on God's provision. Yet, Satan, never satisfied with his failures, was constantly scheming to lead them astray. His bitterness and envy toward God's creation never ceased, and his plans to pull them away from the divine path were relentless. The fig trees, although an unexpected gift from God, were soon to be the subject of another one of Satan's sinister attempts to deceive them. When Adam and Eve were sent to retrieve the figs, Satan saw his chance to strike. He was fully aware of their vulnerability, their hunger, their fear, and their uncertainty in this new world. He could see their longing for the security and comfort of Eden, and he seized this moment to sow confusion and doubt. In his wicked mind, he thought that if he could destroy the figs, he would destroy their faith as well. Satan's action was calculated. He took the figs and buried them in the ground, hoping to leave Adam and Eve without nourishment. He believed that if they were without food, they would grow desperate, and their desperation would make them question God's provision. In his twisted desire to harm them, Satan thought that keeping them hungry would weaken their resolve, making them more susceptible to his influence. But Satan's plan was once again thwarted by God's mercy. Instead of allowing the figs to die, God caused them to grow into 2 thriving trees that would not only nourish, but also stand as a testament to his power and care. These trees grew quickly, right outside the entrance of the cave, their branches full of fruit, offering shade and sustenance to the weary couple. When Adam and Eve first discovered the trees, they were filled with confusion and suspicion. How could these trees have grown so suddenly, they wondered? Are we being deceived again? Their minds, still haunted by the memories of their fall from grace, could not help but question everything that came their way. After all, they had learned the hard way that not everything was as it seemed. Was this truly God's gift, or was it another trick from the enemy? Their doubts and confusion are understandable. After all, they had been led astray once before. They had disobeyed God's command in the garden, and that disobedience had led to their banishment. So now, as they stood before the newly sprouted trees, they couldn't help but wonder if they were being tricked again. Was this truly a blessing from God? Or was it another trap laid by Satan? In their uncertainty, Adam and Eve turned to God in prayer, seeking his guidance. And as always, God responded, reassuring them of his mercy and his plan. "Adam, I sent you to retrieve the figs," God said. But Satan, filled with hatred, took them and buried them. He thought he could destroy them. But I, in my mercy, caused these figs to grow into trees. They will provide you with rest and nourishment, and they will stand as a reminder of my power and your faith. God's words were a comforting balm to their souls. The fig trees, though growing from the enemy's schemes, were now a sign of God's grace and protection. They were a gift, not a trap. Yet, despite God's reassurance, Adam and Eve still had to navigate the tension between trust and doubt. The trees, though a clear sign of God's provision, came with an instruction. They were not to eat the fruit. This was not just a matter of physical sustenance. It was a test of obedience, a reminder that even in times of plenty, Adam and Eve were still called to trust God and obey his commands. The fig trees, then, became more than just a source of food. They were a spiritual lesson. They were a symbol of the ongoing battle between good and evil, between God's provision and Satan's deception. And as Adam and Eve rested beneath their branches, they were reminded that their journey was not just about surviving. It was about trusting God with every step, every decision, and every temptation that came their way. The offering, a sacrifice of gratitude. After the unexpected gift of the fig trees and the clarity that God had provided, Adam and Eve found a new sense of peace. Their faith was being tested in ways they had never imagined. But with each test, they were learning to rely more on God's wisdom and mercy. Yet, their journey was far from over. There was still much to learn, and their new earthly existence had much to teach them. One of the most significant lessons came in the form of an offering. Having witnessed God's mercy and power through the transformation of the figs into trees, Adam and Eve understood that the blessings they had received were not merely for their enjoyment, they were meant to be shared with God in gratitude. And so, they offered a sacrifice to God, a sign of their trust and thankfulness for His provision. This offering was not just an act of ritual, it was an expression of their hearts, a way for Adam and Eve to acknowledge the God who had given them everything. The simple act of offering something back to God became a profound reminder of the relationship they were rebuilding with Him. The sacrifice was a way for them to remember that, though they were now outside the garden, they were still part of God's divine plan. They were still His creation, and they were still His beloved. But this offering was not without its challenges. In the midst of their journey, Satan saw an opportunity to undermine their faith once again. Jealous of the offering Adam and Eve made, Satan sought to disrupt their relationship with God by making their sacrifice a painful and difficult act. One day, as Adam stood at the altar, offering his sacrifice, Satan, disguised as a man, approached with a sharp stone. In a cruel and malicious act, Satan struck Adam, piercing his side with the stone. Blood and water poured from the wound, and Adam collapsed, lifeless, before the altar. Eve, horrified and devastated, rushed to his side, weeping as she tried to revive him. But God, in His infinite mercy, did not leave Adam and Eve in despair. He sent His word to restore Adam, commanding him to complete the offering. "Adam," God said, "you have suffered, but you must finish what you have started. Your offering is of great worth, and it must be completed." As Adam stood up, restored and healed by God's word, he understood the deep significance of the offering. It was not just an act of gratitude, it was an act of faith. And in that moment, he realized that his sacrifice, though painful, was a reflection of the ultimate sacrifice that would one day come. Just as Adam's side had been pierced, so too would Christ's side be pierced for the salvation of all humanity. This offering, this act of sacrifice, became a symbol of the deeper spiritual truths that Adam and Eve were beginning to understand. Through their obedience, their faith, and their sacrifice, they were reconnecting with God. They were learning that their journey was not just about surviving in a fallen world, but about seeking redemption through faith, trust, and obedience. And so, Adam and Eve continued their journey, offering their sacrifices to God, knowing that every act of faith brought them closer to Him. Their journey was not easy, but through each trial, each offering, and each act of obedience, they were learning the profound depth of God's mercy and the deep connection between their physical survival and their spiritual salvation. Their story, though filled with pain and loss, was one of redemption, and every sacrifice, every prayer, and every act of trust brought them one step closer to the hope that lay ahead, the hope of one day returning to the garden, not in their own strength, but through the grace and mercy of God. Through this offering, Adam and Eve's hearts were once again aligned with God's plan. Their faith was growing stronger, and their trust in Him deeper. As they continued their journey, they would come to understand that even in their brokenness, they were part of a larger divine story. a story that would ultimately lead to redemption and eternal peace. As Adam and Eve's journey continued, their faith and obedience were tested in ways they could not have imagined. After offering their sacrifice, Adam found himself once again caught in the crosshairs of Satan's evil schemes. His act of worship, a simple yet profound gesture of gratitude toward God, was met with the cruelty of the enemy. Satan, enraged by the sacrifice that had found favor with God, sought to strike at the heart of Adam's faith in an attempt to tear him down. In a twisted moment of maliciousness, Satan disguised himself as a man, approached Adam as he stood at the altar, and struck him with a sharp iron stone. The blow was swift and brutal. Adam's side was pierced, and blood and water flowed from the wound, mirroring the sacrifice that would come many years later. Adam collapsed, seemingly lifeless, before the altar, the weight of the attack bringing him to the ground. Eve, horrified by the sight of her beloved, rushed to his side in a state of panic. She desperately tried to revive him, but Adam lay motionless, his blood staining the altar they had just built in worship. Her heart was broken, and in the agony of the moment, she must have wondered if all hope was lost. Had Satan finally succeeded in destroying them? Had their faith, their offering, been in vain? Yet, in this moment of utter despair, God's mercy once again intervened. His word came to Adam, calling him back from the brink of death. God's voice was clear, commanding Adam to complete the offering, saying, "Adam, your suffering is not in vain. This sacrifice is of great worth, and you must finish it." As Adam awoke, restored by God's word, he understood something deeply profound. His pain, his suffering, was not just an isolated moment of despair. It was a reflection of a far greater and more eternal truth. Adam's side had been pierced, but this act would point to a future sacrifice, one that would forever change the course of human history. Just as his side had been pierced, so too would Christ's side be pierced on the cross for the salvation of mankind. This moment, though deeply painful, became a prophetic symbol. Adam's suffering was not meaningless. It was a glimpse into the greater redemptive act that would come. Christ, the perfect offering, would one day take on the pain of the world, being pierced for our transgressions, to offer us the hope of eternal life. Adam, realizing this profound connection, stood up, strengthened by God's healing power, and completed the offering he had started. His heart, though wounded, was filled with gratitude for the mercy he had received. In that moment, Adam understood the depth of sacrifice, not just as a physical act, but as a spiritual journey that was connected to God's ultimate plan for redemption. God's restorative power and the replenishment of the wheat field. After the events of the piercing, Adam and Eve faced another challenge that would test their faith and perseverance. Their journey had not been easy, but through every hardship, they were slowly coming to understand God's mercy and provision. However, the trials were far from over. One of the most significant lessons came in the form of God's restorative power, when Satan, once again, tried to destroy their source of sustenance. As Adam and Eve worked the land, they came across a wheat field that was meant to provide for their physical needs. But once again, Satan, ever relentless in his pursuit to undermine God's plans, set his sights on their provision. In a cruel act of destruction, Satan and his followers set fire to the wheat, burning it to the ground. They poured out all the water they had gathered, hoping to leave Adam and Eve without anything to eat or drink. When Adam and Eve saw the destruction, their hearts sank. All their hard work, their hopes for sustenance, had been reduced to ashes. The wheat, once a symbol of God's provision, was gone, and the water was empty. In that moment of despair, they fell to their knees, questioning whether God had abandoned them once again. "Why, Lord?" Adam must have cried. "Why would you let us suffer in this way after all that we have endured?" Yet, as always, God's mercy was never far. In their moment of deepest despair, God's word came to Adam, reassuring him that he had not forsaken them. "Adam, I did not burn the wheat, nor did I pour out the water," God said. "It was Satan, your adversary, who did this. But do not fear, for I will restore what has been taken from you." With these words, Adam and Eve received a new sense of hope. God's restorative power was at work. Not only did God restore the wheat field, but he also replenished the water, filling their buckets once again. The field that Satan had destroyed was now flourishing, full of abundant wheat ready to be harvested. The restoration of the wheat field was a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness. Even when Satan sought to destroy their sustenance, God's power was greater. Adam and Eve were not alone in their struggles. God was with them, even in the most difficult of times, ensuring that they would never be abandoned. This act of restoration was not just about physical provision. It was a sign of God's ongoing care and his commitment to fulfilling his promises. The wheat field, once destroyed, now stood as a symbol of renewal, of life springing forth from the ashes. God had shown them that no matter how hard the enemy might strike, his provision would always be enough. His love would always win. In the face of destruction, Adam and Eve learned that God's plans were always bigger than Satan's schemes. Their struggle, though painful, was never without purpose. Through every trial they faced, God was teaching them how to trust him, how to rely on his provision, and how to see his hand at work in every moment of their journey. The final test: spiritual growth and perseverance. After the restoration of the wheat field, Adam and Eve continued their journey, knowing that their struggles were far from over. Each day brought new challenges, new tests of their faith and perseverance. Yet, with each test, they grew stronger, more resilient, and more aware of God's presence in their lives. The ultimate lesson that Adam and Eve would learn in this time of exile was that faith is not merely about surviving the trials, but about growing spiritually through them. Every challenge they faced, whether it was hunger, loss, or deceit, was an opportunity to deepen their relationship with God. They had learned to trust him, to rely on his provision, and to see his mercy in the midst of their hardships. And so, their journey continued. A journey not of easy answers or perfect circumstances, but of growth, faith, and the unshakable knowledge that God was with them every step of the way. Adam and Eve, though far from the garden, were slowly being transformed, and through every hardship, every moment of despair, they were learning to live in faith, trusting that God's plan would one day restore all things. Their story, though filled with suffering, was a story of hope. And as they moved forward, they carried with them the promise that, though they may never return to the Garden of Eden in their lifetime, God's mercy and provision would lead them to something even greater, the ultimate redemption and return to his presence. In the end, their journey was not just about surviving the trials of this world, but about finding spiritual growth and hope in the midst of them. Their faith, once shaken, had become stronger. And through that faith, they found the strength to endure, knowing that God's love and mercy would always be enough. As we wrap up this incredible journey with Adam and Eve, we come to realize that their story is not just a tale from the past, but a living testament to the struggles, faith, and redemption that each of us experiences in our lives. Their journey from the paradise of Eden to the trials of the earthly world is one of transformation, loss, and ultimately, divine mercy. We see in their struggles echoes of our own challenges, the moments when life seems overwhelming, and we question God's plan for us. But through their example, we learn that even in the hardest moments, God's provision is constant, His mercy never fails, and His promises stand firm, regardless of the darkness we may face. Adam and Eve were not perfect, but they were willing to learn, to grow, and to trust in God's guidance, even when everything around them seemed to crumble. Their willingness to offer sacrifices, to turn to God in their times of doubt, and to obey His commands, despite the pain and confusion they felt, teaches us a valuable lesson. We too must learn to trust in God's timing, to rely on His strength when our own is insufficient, and to remember that He is always with us, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. Their journey is one of hope. Hope that no matter how far we may fall, God's grace can always pick us up, restore us, and guide us back toward the light. Just like the fig trees that grew from Satan's attempts to destroy, our trials can turn into blessings when we allow God's hand to work in our lives. Whether it's the restoration of what has been lost, the peace that comes after struggle, or the strength that arises from hardship, Adam and Eve's story shows us that God is constantly working behind the scenes, turning our defeats into victories. And so, as we reflect on their journey, we are reminded that we too are part of this larger story, one of redemption, growth, and the unfailing love of God. No matter what you are facing today, whether it's a moment of doubt, a season of struggle, or a time of spiritual hunger, know that God sees you. He is with you in every step, just as He was with Adam and Eve. Just as He provided for them in their most desperate hours, He will provide for you. This journey with Adam and Eve is a reminder that we are never alone in our struggles. We may face difficult times, but with faith, perseverance, and the love of God, we can find strength to overcome. Just like them, we are invited to trust in God's plan, to walk with Him through the highs and lows of life, and to find comfort in the knowledge that He is always by our side, offering His mercy and grace, no matter how many times we stumble. So if this story has inspired you, if it has reminded you of the power of faith and trust in God's plan, I invite you to take a moment and reflect on how His mercy has been evident in your life. Maybe you've experienced a season of hardship where you couldn't see the way forward, but now, with the benefit of hindsight, you can see how God has worked in your life. Maybe you're in the midst of a trial right now, and you're wondering if there's hope. Rest assured there is. Just like Adam and Eve, God's love for you is unwavering, and His provision will never fail. If you found strength and encouragement in Adam and Eve's story, consider subscribing to our channel. By doing so, you'll never miss a moment of these powerful, soul-stirring stories that remind us of God's never-ending love, grace, and faithfulness. Don't forget to like this video if you've been moved by the lessons we've shared today. Sharing this message with others can inspire them to trust in God's plan for their lives, just as we have learned from Adam and Eve. It's a story that resonates with us all, no matter where we are in our walk of faith. Thank you for being with us on this incredible journey. Your support means so much, and we are grateful for the opportunity to share these timeless lessons with you. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter in our exploration of the mysteries of the Bible. There are so many more stories, lessons, and truths to uncover together, and we're so glad to have you with us on this adventure. May you find peace, hope, and strength in knowing that, like Adam and Eve, God's plan for you is greater than you could ever imagine, and His mercy is always just a prayer away. Let us walk forward in faith, trusting that no matter the challenge, God is with us every step of the way, leading us to the ultimate redemption He has promised. Thank you for watching, and remember, His love endures forever.